I'm waiting for the sign. So, good evening. Good evening. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to Dialogue for Our Future, a call to climate action, and to the keynote speech which will be delivered by Elizabeth Wathuti. I welcome you on behalf of Iraq Research, Tibet Policy Institute, Czech Support Tibet, and International Campaign for Tibet. My name is Wangari, and I'm the Director of International Campaign for Tibet in Europe. Many people made this very special gathering possible. I won't name all the persons involved, but let me say we are forever indebted to the Office of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, to the Central Tibetan Administration for technical help. We gather here at a very, very difficult moment in our planet's history. There's a terrible war going on in Ukraine. The climate crisis is unresolved. And on the other side of these mountains, in Tibet, a nation and its people are struggling for a future in dignity and freedom. Recent IPCC reports indicate the time is running out for our planet. The situation is extremely dangerous. Is it too late? No, we have the solution. What we need is the will and action on an individual and global level. We came to Dharamsala and are inspired by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I quote him, "When we see pictures of the earth from space, we see no boundaries between us, just this one blue planet, a place where climate change affects us all." It is with this knowledge and in this spirit that we gather here together online, and according to Greg, there are some 100, maybe we crossed the 1,000 mark, yeah? Persons from different backgrounds, experiences, cultures, and histories. Thank you for coming to Dharamsala. Thank you to all of you around the world for your interest in being with us. I would like now to introduce you to Elizabeth Wathuti and Kunda Dixit. May I ask you to come? No, I will first introduce you, yeah, and then ask you to come in front. Elizabeth Wanjiru Wathuti is a Kenyan environment and climate activist and founder of the Green Generation Initiative, which inspires a love of nature and has now planted 30,000 tree seedlings in Kenya. In 2019, Elizabeth was awarded the African Green Person of the Year award by the 11-11-12 Foundation and named one of the 100 most influential young Africans by the Africa Youth Awards. Kunda Dixit is publisher of the English language weekly newspaper Nepali Times. Kunda is a graduate of Columbia University. He is the author of several books, including a trilogy on the Nepali conflict and Dateline Earth, Journalism as if the Planet Mattered. He teaches media studies at Kathmandu University and is a visiting faculty at New York University, Abu Dhabi. May I now ask you both to come here and ask Elizabeth to deliver her keynote speech. Please welcome the two.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Wathuti, and I am a climate activist from Kenya. and it's a great honor to be with you today to help open this conference. Almost half a year ago, I had the opportunity to participate in the opening ceremony of a very different kind of conference, the COP26 Climate Conference in Glasgow. The summit was billed as humanity's last best chance to avoid catastrophic climate change, and I was allocated 4 minutes in which to address world leaders directly. The responsibility of that moment weighed very heavily on me, and I did a lot of soul-searching about what I might say, not least because I honestly did not know what there was left to say that might move the world leaders to act at the scale and speed that we all know is needed. The global community has been coming together to negotiate outcomes at environmental and climate conferences for many more decades than I have been alive. Every year, we receive more and better science that makes clear just how fast we are hurtling towards catastrophe. And every year, more and better science also points us to concrete steps that we could take immediately to get us out of this mess. And that is if we want to turn things around. Armed with all of this information, however, we still somehow find ourselves at the precipice of an interconnected triple planetary emergency of a worsening climate, nature, and pollution crisis. And I have found myself asking, how can this be? Why is it that even as we are presented with more and more information about the causes and the solutions to these problems, we are failing to take the urgent action needed to address them? I wanted to use my remarks at COP26 to say something that might go to the heart of this question, because the answer feels important. So in the end, I chose to use my 4 minutes with world leaders to shine a spotlight on the suffering that the climate crisis is already bringing to bear in my home country of Kenya and across the African continent. Right now, over 2 million of my fellow Kenyans and more than 10 million people in neighboring countries across the Horn of Africa are facing climate-related starvation. A historic drought has seen 3 successive rainy seasons fail, and scientists say that it may be many months before the rains return. Rivers are running dry, our harvests are failing, storehouses stand empty, and our animals and people are dying. I have seen with my own eyes 3 young children crying at the side of a dried-up river after walking 12 miles with their mother to find water. Climate-driven disasters are not only happening in Kenya. Over the last few years, deadly heat waves and wildfires have swept through Algeria. Devastating floods have taken many lives in Uganda, Nigeria, and most recently, South Africa. And we know there is more to come. Sub-Saharan Africans are responsible for just 0.5% of historical emissions, and the young children of Sub-Saharan Africa are responsible for none. But it is they who are bearing the brunt of these climate impacts. If you allow yourself to feel it, the heartbreak and the injustice of this is hard to bear. But this is precisely what I asked world leaders at COP26 to do. I asked them to open their hearts and act. I held a moment's compassionate silence so that they might actually allow themselves to feel the immense suffering that our way of doing things is causing. I was moved to do this not because I wanted to blame or shock anyone, but because I believe that an open heart is where the seed of true action lies within each of us. I believe in our human capacity to care deeply and to act collectively. I believe in our ability to do what is right if we let ourselves feel it in our hearts. And I believe that we can absolutely find our way out of the planetary crisis we face. But to do so, we will need to change our way of thinking and start telling new stories about what is important and what is possible. This last insight is something that I have drawn from the legacy of the late Professor Wangari Maathai. On Earth Day in 1977, almost exactly 45 years ago, Professor Wangari Maathai founded the Green Belt movement to help ordinary people across Kenya plant trees. Her aim was initially to address deforestation while improving the lives of rural women by providing them with a source of fuel, food, shelter, and income to support the education of their own children. But our movement quickly grew into something much, much more bigger. Professor Wangari Maathai's efforts to protect public green spaces from destruction eventually mobilized thousands of citizens to take action against widespread abuses of power and corruption in government. And she continued to stand up for what she believed in, even after she was beaten, harassed, and jailed for it. In 2002, she was voted into parliament and appointed Assistant Environment Minister. And by the time she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004, the Green Belt movement had spread beyond Kenya and planted over 30 million trees and employed thousands of women. I grew up in Nyeri County, the most forested region in Kenya, where Professor Wangari Maathai was a member of parliament. And my grandmother would tell me stories about all the amazing things that she was doing. I remember feeling so proud watching her win the Nobel Peace Prize on the news. While I never got the opportunity to meet Professor Wangari Maathai while she was alive, her story is my greatest inspiration and continues to shape my life. Prof's work inspired me to start the Green Generation Initiative, a tree-growing initiative that enhances food security for young Kenyans when I was 20 years old. So far, we have grown thousands of fruit trees to maturity, providing desperately needed nutrition to thousands of children. And it's Prof's legacy that has led me to working as the head of campaigns such as the Urban Green Spaces Protection campaigns at the Wangari Maathai Foundation under the guidance of Professor Wangari Maathai's daughter, Wanjira Maathai. I am grateful to Wangari Maathai every day that I'm able to visit green spaces like Uhuru Park and Karura Forest in Kenya, which would no longer exist if it were not for her extraordinary courage. With her hands and heart, she sowed the seeds of a future that my generation is now reaping. There's so much love to admire about Prof's life. And the example that she set through her compassionate leadership lives on through her story and the lives of all the people that she touched. Well, ahead of her time, she argued that a change in consciousness will be needed if humanity is to stop destroying its life support system. And well ahead of her time, she understood the wrong-headedness of valuing a natural resource for what it can buy rather than what it can do. That ecocide, in fact, means suicide. And one of the most important legacies, perhaps the most relevant of all for what we have come together to discuss this week, is that she showed people that they could be agents of their own future, even when the challenges they face feel very overwhelming. One of Wangari Maathai's guiding lights was the story of the hummingbird. The story starts with a forest that is being consumed by a raging fire. And all of the animals who live in the forest, big and small, flee as fast as they can away from the flames and gather at the tree line. And they stand huddled together, terrified and transfixed by the sight of their only home going up in flames. And by this time, they are feeling very overwhelmed and very powerless. And they're standing there completely paralyzed by fear and despair, all except for a tiny hummingbird who says, "I love this forest, and I am going to do the best that I can." So the hummingbird flies to the nearest stream and dives beneath the surface. Rising into the air, it carries a single drop of water in its beak, flies back towards the fire and releases the droplet over the flames. The fire is very huge, but over and over, up and down, as fast as it can, the hummingbird flies to the stream, returns with a drop of water, and drops it onto the flames. And while this is happening, the other animals, some who are very big with long trunks and large mouths that could carry much more water, are looking at the tiny bird and they're telling the bird, what do you think you can do? So they're looking at the bird and standing there feeling helpless and doing nothing. And during this time, they ridicule the bird and they keep asking this hummingbird, what do you think you can do? You are too little. This fire is too big. Your beak is too tiny. And as they continue to say these things to discourage it, the hummingbird turns on its wings and says to them, I am doing the best that I can. And Wangari Maathai believed that is all each of us is called to do, to be like the hummingbird. So you may feel insignificant. You might not know whether or not you can overcome the enormous challenges in front of you. But who among us wants to be like the animals watching as their only home goes up in flames? Certainly not me. So let us be like the hummingbird and do the best that we can. We can definitely act from a place of love and compassion. So let us be like the hummingbird and do the best that we can, because you never know where it might lead. Thank you very much.
Everyone here physically present in this room, as well as hundreds of people who have joined us on Zoom from around the world. I'll invite questions from the floor as well as from people on Zoom chat after we've had a short conversation. The theme of this, the next 2 days of conference here in Dharamsala is the dialogue for the future. And who better to represent our future than someone like you, who's already accomplished so much in your 26 years of life. And you rightly pointed out how much you're inspired by Wangari Maathai. You almost seem to be a reincarnation of Wangari Maathai. You spoke a little bit about how much she inspired you, but maybe you could, add a little bit more about how exactly, what her work meant for Kenya and her own home district, as well as yours, and how it is propelling you in your work today.
Thank you. I would say Wangari Maathai was one of the most selfless and courageous leaders that was at that time, because she was an African woman who stood up at a time when African women did not have a voice in society. And she stood up to protect the resources that my generation is enjoying today. And like I mentioned, every time I visit some of the spaces that she fought so hard for, I can't help but thank her. And it's the same thing that I would hope for the world, that we would be able to enjoy resources that the previous generations have been able to protect. And reflecting also on the story of the hummingbird, it tells us that everybody can do something, because she did what she did because she felt it was the right thing to do. And everybody can do what they can because it's definitely the right thing to do to protect this planet for all generations to come. And she has continued to be a great inspiration, because that kind of leadership is the kind of leadership that we want in the world today. A kind of leadership that is selfless, a kind of leadership where we are not doing things for the sake of our own selves, or we are not doing things for the sake of profits, but we are doing things for the sake of our people, for the sake of the planet, and for the sake of those that will inherit this planet after us. And I think that, to me, is the most important thing that Professor Wangari Maathai tried so hard to achieve. And today, we are definitely reaping her benefits. And it's the same way that her legacy continues to live on, because she fought so hard for all these resources. And again, she was a voice in society. She did not just sit back, or she did not give up, even at times when she was harassed, at times when her life was threatened. She did not stop at that. She continued, and today my generation is able to reap those benefits. And to me, that would be the kind of leadership that today's world leaders ought to also show and portray, so that the next generation can continue to have food and water. Because without that kind of leadership, it's going to be impossible for us to have a livable world now and a safe future.
Yeah, and when Professor Maathai started her work of reforestation and greening and the Green Belt Initiative, climate change was not that well known. I mean, global warming, people said, what is that? Even the scientists were not really finding proof of anthropogenic carbon leading to global warming. But what she did was actually an answer to the problems we're facing today, and it's the legacy that you are carrying on. Yeah. So it's almost like this catalytic work at that time, which almost predates the problem that we now know as climate change and the climate crisis. But there's a lot of cynicism around the world. And a lot of people say that the climate emergency is such a serious problem, it's so global, it has such enormous impact, we don't even want to think about it because it's like nuclear war. And what can I do as an individual, because it'll be a drop in the ocean, and let's leave it up to our leaders. Now, you haven't done that. You, as an individual, have not just changed yourself, but you're also your society, and you've taken your community along. And like Professor Maathai, you're an example to the rest of the world. So what does it take for individual initiative like yours to convert into collective action? I mean, what is the spark that's needed? I mean, obviously you start with an example, you set an example yourself, but what else?
Yeah, as part of my backstory, and one of the reasons why I find myself fighting for nature in this space is because I've loved nature ever since I was young. And I have learned that when you love nature and connect to nature, you will stand up to protect and fight for nature. And for me, when I was having this moment where I would spend time among the trees and spend time close to clean streams, I did not realize that actually there were challenges beyond my own community, challenges beyond my own country. And for me, I was doing it out of love for nature. I was doing it because when we protect nature, we are protecting ourselves. And when we save nature, we are saving ourselves. And I also like to reflect on one of the things that Wangari Maathai always used to say, that nature hits back, that when we destroy nature, we are definitely destroying ourselves. And for me, one of the very things that made me to also continue in this space and to actually go beyond loving nature, but go to the extent of co-creating with nature, is at times when I began to feel angry, witnessing deforestation, feeling angry, seeing how people were treating nature wrongly, because we need to treat nature right, because we are nature ourselves. And if we cannot feel the wrong things we are doing to nature, then we are disconnected. So it's important that we feel that connection that we have with nature. And one of the things that I chose to do was to turn my anger into a hunger to want to do something to respond to challenges like deforestation and challenges like the climate crisis. And I realized that there was more beyond the borders, that the trees we were planting in Kenya also would be affected due to the rising impacts of climate change if we do not address the impacts beyond the Kenyan borders. And that is when I discovered that it has to go beyond the borders. And I'll give a good example with the trees that we are planting with the children. Every day these children are planting trees within their school compounds. And they are doing this because they don't want to be victims of the climate crisis. They see the urgency. They want to respond. They want to have food in their school. They want to have water. And they understand that to do this, they have to be part of the solution. But again, beyond the school borders, these children are seeing people, big corporations, governments cutting down huge ecosystems and forests. They see countries still burning fossil fuels. They see people destroying the very planet they're trying to protect. And definitely this continues to undermine the very efforts of these children. And that is why it's important to note that for us to be able to solve this crisis, we will need everyone. We will need every sector, because there are sectors definitely that continue to undermine efforts that continue to be done by different people, by different individuals. So we cannot say that this work should be left to a certain group of people. We cannot say that this work should be left to the activists. This work is everyone's work. And just like the hummingbird, we should do the best that we can. But the best that I can is probably is not the best that a one leader can. It's not the best that someone who has a capacity and resources to do can. Everybody should focus on making sure that we're doing the best that we can. So reflecting on that, it is important for everybody to identify with that challenge and make sure that we are not sitting back and feeling helpless, but we are doing whatever we can in terms of individual responsibility and behavior, in terms of our investment choices. Where is the money being invested in? If it's not in nature, it shouldn't be towards the destruction of nature. It should be towards making sure that this planet is habitable for all the generations.
It's amazing how eloquent she is after having flown all night from Nairobi to Doha to Delhi to Dharamshala. You know, as a journalist, I've been writing on environment for long before you were born. And on climate change, maybe the last 25 years. For the first time I wrote about a story on global warming was 25 years ago. And the frustration for me is, obviously, you know, what I write is not going to make a big difference. But all of us in the media, whoever have been trying to draw attention to this problem by taking scientific research to the general public and explaining the crisis, the frustration is that things have not just not got better, but they're getting worse. And they're, you know, collective action, the governments coming together, Glasgow, as you said, and even since Glasgow, we've seen sort of a regression in terms of commitments, even at a time when the scientific evidence is getting more and more urgent. I just wonder whether us old dinosaurs in the media are in the right profession. I mean, maybe I think we should all be turning into activists, and because there seems to be more impact there. Media is just too indirect and too slow to be an agent of change. What do you think? What should our roles be?
I would say everyone has got a key role to play. And just to reflect on what you've said, it's really sad and also makes me feel angry that even with all this information, we still are not doing enough. We still are not doing what is supposed to be done. And the gap between what science says we must do and what we are doing is still much far wider every day. And it shouldn't be, because we're talking about a crisis that is costing lives, a crisis that is costing livelihoods, a crisis that is leading people to be homeless. And we keep ignoring this crisis that is about lives and livelihoods of people who have even least contributed to this crisis. And I would say it is about making sure that everybody begins to get concerned, because it's no longer about, like I mentioned, leaving this work to a certain group of people. I think it's about time that everybody begins to actually get concerned and begin to actually get our leaders, to get everybody to take the needed action. Because every day it looks like we keep moving backwards, even with more information each and every day. And like you mentioned back then, there was not all this science, all this information was not there. But today we have all these benefits. Why is it that we still are not being moved to take action? And there's something I always say, that just because the climate crisis is not happening where you are, it does not mean that it's not happening at all. There are people who are trying to find a way out of the challenges they're facing every day caused by this crisis. So it is about making sure that we are communicating, that we are telling the right stories, and that also we are talking about what is possible. Because we have been used to receiving commitments and pledges from governments, from corporations, but none of this is ever fulfilled. So why can't we begin to actually treat the crisis as it is and actually turn all these commitments and pledges into action? And this is the only way that we're going to get ourselves out of this mess. Because either way, the words are not going to help us get food and water for the people that don't have food and water. It's going to be about what we choose to do today and not what we promise to do tomorrow, because people are not waiting for the impacts of this crisis to hit tomorrow. It's happening right now. Even as we speak today, people are suffering from this crisis. So I think it's about time that we get out of that shell of trying to look like we're taking action, and yet we still continue to make promises that are never met. And I think that's the biggest challenge today. We have to actually solve the crisis of listening and feeling as well. We have to listen to one another, listen to the communities that are faced with the worst impacts of climate change, and then we have to also feel and acknowledge their sufferings and then get moved to actually take action.
Well, that goes to the heart of one question that has just come in on Zoom, which is, what can individuals do right now to combat climate change, right? And there is a difference. Like, you have someone in a, let's say, an industrialized country, an individual working, commuting to work back and forth every day. For that person, climate change may be very far away. There are lots of other choices to be done. There is, society is more prosperous. And then we have people in countries like ours where survival is such a necessity from day to day that, again, climate change, climate crisis is just so far away. Although it's affecting them from day to day, they cannot take individual action because it's just a question of, getting food to survive. Now, so where does individual action come in to both these individuals in a rich country and a poor country?
Yeah. I would say individual action comes when we first educate ourselves about this crisis, because then you cannot solve a challenge that you actually do not also understand, or a challenge that you do not relate with, a challenge that you do not see the realities of it. And the way we will be able to see the realities of the climate crisis is by educating ourselves, listening to these stories that are being told about people who are facing the worst impacts of the crisis, listening to the science, and then understanding that as individuals, we can definitely do something about this challenge. And when you educate yourselves, you will definitely be moved to also educate others, to reach out to people, to let your communities know, to let your leaders know that we are still, wasting a lot of time that could be used to take action. And when you educate yourselves, this is the point when you understand and relate with challenges that are around you, or challenges that are beyond the borders as well. Because for me, the main reason that I got to also get into activism was also after educating myself and realizing that this challenge was beyond the borders, and understanding that I also needed to use my voice to influence how others are responding to the climate crisis beyond my own individual action and responsibility. And I would say that it depends on where everyone is coming from. We all definitely have different challenges, but we all can do something about this crisis. And I've just given a good example of the initiative of green trees that we are doing in my country. And we are definitely doing this to also try and increase the tree cover in the country. And at the same time, because people heavily depend on natural resources, and we need to educate these communities to understand that these resources are there to help us in our very own survival. And definitely, if we continue to educate people, educate the young generation, and then use our voices to call on our governments, to call on our leaders to do what must be done, then collectively, we will definitely be making a huge difference, because we can never separate individual responsibility from system change. And movements are what helps change all the systems that we're talking about. And the only best way to build movements is to make sure that we continue building up on people power. I strongly believed a lot in people power and solidarity at COP26, seeing people out of the blue zone, out on the streets, trying to get the leaders in the blue zone to make the right decisions. And I think when we come together as these communities and also make sure that the people on the front lines are actually being listened to, and they actually are the ones who are being able to share their stories as well, then we will be able to connect and support them, and we'll be able to connect and do what must be done in our very own countries as well.
Some of these questions will be addressed in the next few days in the sessions we have.
Yeah.
And obviously, we have experts with experience from all over the world joining us virtually as well as physically. But before I throw the floor open for questions for the people physically here. There's another one here from on the Zoom chat. You know, we just had COP26 5 months ago. You were there. You gave the very, very powerful speech there at COP26 in Glasgow. And now there's COP27. It's happening in Egypt. When is it? In a few months. If you were to deliver them, meaning the world leaders in Egypt at COP27, a to-do list, what would be on top of that list?
One of the main to-do list would be, I mean, everyone is talking about COP27 being an African COP just because it's happening in Egypt. But that is not the definition of an African COP for me. An African COP means a COP where the voices and the needs of Africa are actually represented in the outcome. And we do not want to see an outcome that does not support or represent the present needs of Africa, because giving us an outcome that is talking about years to come is not going to help the African continent, because the African continent is facing the worst impacts of the crisis right now. And so every day the leaders talk about solidarity, but we don't see the solidarity in these packages that we get out of these COPs. So one of my very first in the list would be an outcome that actually represents the current needs of the African continent, and not an outcome full of fake promises and commitments that never get to be fulfilled. The continent is facing the impacts right now, and what is going to make a difference and support the continent is the action that we're doing right now. And actually, we should never wait for the COPs for leaders to take action. Action should be happening right now, before the COPs. And at the COPs, we should know what the leaders have done differently and not what they are going to do in the future, because climate change is not going to happen in the future. It's happening right now, and so we need action right now, not tomorrow.
Yeah, and we're better to look at that as here in the Himalaya, where you're seeing receding and shrinking glaciers, you're seeing extreme weather events, droughts, just like you have in Kenya, subsistence farmers who depended on rain-fed agriculture, having no other options. And this is besides the disasters that we're also looming, because the glacial lakes are getting bigger and bigger, and there's a danger of them bursting. And it's a transnational problem, because these mountains, transcend boundaries. The rivers and the glaciers flow down from one country to another and downstream down to the sea. And we're literally here at the roof of the world. Different countries are affected in different ways, but there are also commonalities between them. And it needs that collective action, which obviously in Kenya you have been the spark of. Anyone from the physical? If there's no other questions, I'll go to the Zoom. Okay. Yeah. Please go ahead. Do you have a microphone? There's one coming. Yeah.
Hello? Hello? I applaud your efforts in emphasizing individual responsibilities in this climate crisis, but I also think there is this tendency to overlook how governments have consistently picked corporate interests over climate issues. And if we look at environmental crisis and movements around the world, what we see is a clash of sovereign issues. Local communities trying to protect their environments against corporate interests that are in cahoots with central government. So I think it's really important to emphasize how much government and corporate interests plays a role, despite the fact that there needs to be an emphasis on individual cultural shift as far as caring about the environment. Ultimately, it's laws that determine what happens to our lands. So I do think there needs to be more conversations on governmental roles, issues of sovereignty, and how government interests consistently pick, corporate interests over climate issues. So I hope as this climate conference continues, there's more emphasis on the role of how we need to actually make governments accountable.
You want to take that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think definitely this is going to come up in the sessions tomorrow and day after. Yes?
I'm Amit Kumar Thakur from Delhi. In the climate crisis, we see that those who are not responsible to create it, 90% of the population who are not responsible to create climate crisis, and which is almost about 85% of the world population, and they are the who are preserving it to an extent that best of the air, best of the water is available for the rest 15%. Oh. And they also don't know about it. They are also not aware about it. So many dialogues are happening across the world. So what should be done at the government level to see that the organization or the set of community at the local action at the community level who are actually not responsible but are most vulnerable? What should be done at the highest level? Because so much of investment is happening, but the results are as such that day after day it's getting worse than better. So where is the pitfall, and how should we move ahead in this direction?
Yeah, so how do policy decisions trickle down to the grassroots?
Yes, so my response to the two questions, and a very good emphasis on the fact that individual responsibility should never be used as an excuse for governments or corporations not to take action needed to address the climate crisis, because we definitely see much of it happening as well, where corporations, for example, are funding tree growing initiatives, but on the other hand, on large scales, they are the ones that are still fueling deforestation. So that in itself is not climate action. And climate action definitely is also taking responsibility, looking at historical emissions, who is most responsible, and what are they doing right now to solve this crisis from their own perspective. And I think one of the most important things is the fact that we, the people who understand the urgency, can definitely hold our leaders accountable to make sure that they are also doing the best that they can, that they are actually doing what must be done and not actually the best that they can. Because the leaders have the power, they have the capacity, they have the resources, they have everything it takes to solve this crisis. But still we keep moving backwards, and yet we have people in power. So we, the people who understand this, definitely do have the capacity and that power to get them and to actually demand for action, because we are at a time when we can no longer beg to have a safe future. We can no longer beg to have clean air to breathe. We can no longer beg to have clean drinking water. We can no longer beg to have food when people who are responsible for this still continue to live their lives as though we are not in a crisis. So it is about the people who understand strongly and who really relate to these issues coming together and continuing to not only do what they can from their perspectives, but also pushing and demanding for urgent action, real urgent action from the leaders and the people who have got the huge capacity and resources to do so. Because as much as we also continue to do the best that we can, we ourselves cannot be able to solve this crisis. We will need people to make drastic changes, the world leaders, the corporations, to make drastic changes that are going to help us solve this crisis and close that gap between what science must be done and what we are doing at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that there is no action. Even corporates are reacting to public pressure and public opinion. We've seen that around the world. But there's also a lot of greenwashing.
Yeah.
I mean, making these show of doing something, but actually substantially, they haven't really weaned themselves away from fossil fuels or a different culture of the. Here's a question from someone, obviously here in Dharamshala. You will visit the Tibetan Children's Village School tomorrow, and it's Earth Day. What will you do there? What will your message be?
I have always loved working with children, and being a young person who has loved nature since I was a little child, it has always been really special for me spending time with children and understanding what their perspective is around the climate crisis and also what their perspective is around nature. And so definitely I will spend time with them talking about nature, the climate crisis, and also listening to them as well. And I'm also going to be planting some trees with them at the same time.
And you'll also be meeting His Holiness the Dalai Lama. What will your message be to him?
So my message to the Dalai Lama will definitely be around love and compassion. Because like I've mentioned, I strongly believe that we can make a huge difference if we choose to act from deep within our hearts. But again, I want to understand, why is it that things are still not changing? How do we get world leaders and people who are in power to actually be moved to act from this place of love and compassion?
Anyone? Yes, please. Right here.
In your country, in Kenya, and also in the continent in general, in Africa, what do you see as the biggest challenge or hurdle to collective mobilization and people's movements, to kind of bring to account the leaders and those in power? What is the biggest hurdle?
I think the biggest challenge, I would say, is the fact that we are definitely faced with many other challenges at the same time. That we are trying to solve a crisis. We are trying to get people out of poverty. We are trying to get people to get good education. And we are trying to get young people to be in employment. So there are all these challenges at the same time that also sometimes make it difficult to bring mobilization. But also sometimes it's not always as easy as you see, for example, in Western countries where people can mobilize in thousands and be out on the streets and actually demand for action. It's not always as safe, and sometimes you're left to do what you can from your own community and not really be out there demanding for action, because definitely things keep being different every other time. So I would say that's the main challenge. But again, people are stepping up beyond the challenge and still choosing not to be held back by these challenges. And still, so many young people are coming out right now to demand that leaders do what must be done. And there are so many movements and lots of initiatives, even in my own country, of young people who are trying to make a difference in their own community. They are not sitting back and waiting for the challenge of food insecurity to continue destroying lives, but they're stepping up and trying to do what they can to help their own communities. Even when sometimes they don't have enough resources, they still continue to run all these initiatives and movements. And I think that is one of the best ways in which we can continue to build up on movements, even with challenges, that yes, we can use these challenges as stepping stones and still mobilize and come up with solutions that we can use at that moment.
There's a question from the Philippines, University of the Southern Philippines. How can students like us help in mitigate and combat climate change?
So one of my best advice to students, and the first, just I'll repeat, is always educating yourselves, but also most importantly, finding a movement around you that you can join, because one of the most important things that has continued to hold together the youth climate movement is standing in solidarity. That someone in Philippines would write to me when they're having a challenge, and we would definitely, for example, have a piece together to support the challenge that they are facing. That I would write to a young activist in a country beyond my country, and then they would stand in solidarity to help in the same challenges. So it would be great for the students to join a movement, join an initiative, join a community around you that is trying to make a difference, because sometimes it may be challenging to start one on your own. But to begin with, you could join a movement around you and make sure that you are making a difference, because sometimes, like at the moment, we have so many young people who are facing eco-anxiety. They are feeling afraid of how the future might be because of climate change. And these feelings are making young people also feel as though they can definitely not do so much. And while this burden should not be left to us to solve it, we can definitely use our voices to hold our leaders accountable by joining some of these movements. And then we can do what we can from our own communities to solve the challenges that we are facing within us.
Yeah, question here.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I saw you in COP26, congratulations. You raised the interesting issue you've been doing for 25 years, environmental journalism, and your feeling. And when I started environmental science in 1979, that was the year when Carney report, the report of the United States Academy of Science, was presented in the US Congress. And that was the first scientific report which showed that burning of fossil fuels cause global warming. So we do have the evidence for a very long time. But there was a period when journalists, sorry to generalize like this, they sort of, democratic journalists, they sort of balanced. They took the scientific evidence and then they also balanced with the opinion of others. My feeling is that after COP21 in Paris, this is not no more like this. But my question is so that you have some connection. Can you try to define a climate responsible journalism? How journalists can help us to combat climate change?
Yeah, give us some advice.
Yes, I think one of the most challenges that we face in terms of communicating the climate crisis definitely also touches on journalism and the media. And it's about what stories are being highlighted out there, who is actually speaking for the African continent, for example, who is telling the stories of communities who are most impacted by the climate crisis, for example, in the African continent. How often are these stories being highlighted? And sometimes we give examples of when the Amazon rainforest is on fire and everybody is reporting about it. It almost takes months and months and everybody's talking about it. But when the Congo rainforest is facing these challenges of degradation as well, almost nobody is talking about it. There's not much reporting as it is for the Amazon, for example. So I would say it's about what kind of stories are we telling out there and how we amplify voices from communities that are most impacted by climate change. Because these are some of the communities that also almost never get chances to even have their voices heard in the decision-making platforms. So if they miss their voices in these platforms where leaders are making decisions, and they miss their voices in journalism, nobody's highlighting these stories, how then will we tell that we are actually listening to them? How will we make sure that people get a chance to feel and acknowledge their sufferings if they are not being highlighted? And secondly, I think telling these stories to completion. We talk about the African continent, for example, and we highlight the challenges that the African continent is facing. But we should not be stopping at the challenges, because the people in the African continent are not just sitting back and choosing to be victims of this crisis. There are numerous initiatives and programs that people are working on each and every day to make sure that they are responding to this crisis. So making sure that these grassroots movements that are doing the work on the ground, the work that leaders are promising to do tomorrow, there are people that are working on that work today. But then some of these initiatives don't get that kind of needed support because, again, they're not able to amplify their work. And if we can also definitely continue to tell this information in ways that even grassroots communities can understand and also relate to the fact that they have power and they have capacity to stand up and respond and demand for accountability from the leaders, then it would be great that we definitely take the science and also communicate and make sure that we are communicating at the level of everyone. Because sometimes it takes someone to actually bring the reality of the crisis. I think we need to start humanizing the climate crisis. We need to bring it down to the realities on the ground. We need to take the science and actually communicate the realities that are happening on the ground, because what the science is saying is actually a reality somewhere else at the moment. So if we can find ways of humanizing this crisis in the stories that we are telling, I think that way we can be able to solve the crisis of listening and feeling.
Yes, that's definitely very good advice, because I think there's too much scientific jargon out there, and we are not doing enough as media to bring out the human side of how the climate emergency is impacting, especially the really vulnerable people living in remote areas, the voiceless who never get heard. But your remark about this objectivity and neutrality, that is definitely a part of the problem, was a part of the problem. The aspiring for this false equivalence, which is actually drummed into us in journalism school, is that you have to listen to all sides and have a balance. But when your scale of social justice is so skewed and you are objective or neutral, then you're actually perpetuating the injustice because you're not really trying to redress that balance. And it's probably that false equivalence of the past decades of coverage of the environment that has led to climate denial, climate skepticism. But of course, it's gone to another level now, although the media has changed, but it's gone to another level where anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, and climate deniers are the same people. So there's something else happening there in society which we have to get to the bottom of. Anyway, to get back to Elizabeth, I think there is a question from, it takes a lot of strength and perseverance to become an activist. How does one start the journey of taking the first step to create a movement? Like, what is your first step? You talked about it, how as a child you were, you're close to nature.
Yes.
But what is the spark?
I think the spark is, and I would like to respond this with a quote that Professor Wangari Maathai always said. She always said that those of us who understand, who feel strongly, must not tire, and we must not give up, because the burden is on us who know, and those who don't know are at peace. So it is us who know that get disturbed and are caused to take action. And that's why my first spark was the fact that I learned the art of turning my anger into a hunger to want to do something about these challenges. Because until you feel disturbed, then you are not going to get that natural call to action. I think for me, the first spark is realizing that we can definitely get that natural call to action, but we cannot get that natural call to action if we are not connecting ourselves with what is surrounding us, if we are not connecting ourselves with nature, connecting ourselves with what is around our communities. And by connecting ourselves with what is around us, then we are able to feel disturbed by the challenges that we see. If you see challenges around you, you see people destroying entire ecosystems and you're not feeling disturbed, there's a challenge, there's a problem. And with that, you're not able to get that natural call to action. And for me, I think that first step is listening to that point and actually being able to understand that you're feeling disturbed for a reason. Because most of the times people feel disturbed, but they choose to ignore anyway. I think that's where the world is at the moment. We have all this information, yes, we feel disturbed, but still we choose to ignore the crisis, even when we know that if we don't do anything, then things are going to be worse in the coming years. So I think the first step is to stop ignoring the climate crisis. And when we stop ignoring the climate crisis, then we will move a step further from that natural call to action and actually choose to do something. And it doesn't matter what we choose to do, but as long as we choose to do something, then that in itself is the first step to responding to the climate crisis from your own space and perspective.
You spoke a little bit about the media, but I think you meant the mainstream media, right? The legacy media, like us white-haired people do. But how about this? Social media, how much is it a disseminator of your ideas and call to action and activism? How much does it help? Or is it a hindrance?
No, social media helps a lot. And one of the activists actually who uses social media a lot, and you can tell online there's so many young activists as well who are using social media as a tool to communicate to people around ourselves, to communicate to leaders, to communicate at times when certain decisions are being made. And for instance, when we have forums where leaders are meeting, we use social media also as a tool to communicate what we want, because if we are not in those rooms, then we can find ourselves into the rooms through what we have and make sure that we communicate that this is what we want. And we have seen actually campaigns that have been run on social media, and on the ground they end up succeeding. So we cannot say that we only use one stream of media of communication. We need to use everything that we have at the moment to communicate and push for action. While we are pushing on the ground, we still continue to push on social media. We still continue to push on mainstream media, but make sure that we are not losing any opportunity at the moment to communicate and push for action, even if it takes to do social media. And right now, we really have a world that has a very young population. So many people have got access to technology. So we do have that opportunity to use social media as well to communicate about the crisis and to also get leaders to take more action. But also, how do we use these tools as well to reach to people who don't have access to technology? So we, the people who have access to technology and can actually understand, can share with others, we are the same people that can use that information to take to the grassroots people who have no access to technology, who have a challenge with energy. But we can never say that we are only using one set of communication. And it's the same way with making sure that we are also focusing on local media as well. Local media that communicate in local languages as well, to make sure that everybody is actually being involved and actually has access to this information.
Yes, please. Oh, sorry. Did you have? Sorry. Okay. You're next.
First of all, I really, as a Tibetan, first of all, as a Tibetan, we really like to welcome you here in Dharamsala. Of course, this is not our real home, it's our second home. Hopefully sometime in the future, when you are still young, we can invite you to Tibet. On a very light note, I'd like to ask you, what was your imagination of the Tibetan Plateau? I'm sure you must have some imagination when you received this invitation to come here. So I was really wondering, someone from Kenya, in the central of Africa, what was your, the Great Tibetan Plateau? What was your idea? Thank you very much.
Parts of Kenya is also plateau, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely love being here. First, I was really excited to be here for the first time. And I think one of the most unique thing, and I don't know if you're asking in terms of the place, because I really love the place. I come from the mountains, like I mentioned. I come from the most forested region in Kenya. And I remember on my way here, I kept mentioning that I feel at home. Because when I look around me, I see the trees. And when I'm at home, it's the same way. I see trees around me. And also, I think one of the main things, I have been listening to the teachings of the Dalai Lama as well, and looking at the messaging around love and compassion. I think for me this was really important, especially after delivering the keynote at COP26 around opening your hearts. And I did feel how much all these messages were so much connected, that how much, this communication of how we can respond to the crisis was actually all connected. And I couldn't wait to actually be at this dialogue as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really very interesting. I'm Vibha Dhawan from TEDi. It's one of the knowledge-based organizations working in the field of climate change. And we were very fortunate to have you in our Track 2 Summit, World Sustainable Development Summit. Now, all the time we are talking about, we say save the planet, but I think we say wrong, because planet will live very well, will survive very well without us. So what we are trying to do is that save the humankind on this planet, which have excessively used all the resources that it inherited. You rightly mentioned that it's the poor communities which suffer the most, and for no fault of theirs. If we look at where we are in Himalayas, the frequency of cloudbursts, floods, deforestation, landslides, that what perhaps we have faced till now, or humanity has faced till now, we have faced it in the last 10 years. You talk to those communities, they have lost everything. And it's not their generation, perhaps their next generation is also going to suffer, because if they have lost their father or mother in the landslide, then it is suffering for the entire life of theirs. So somewhere, those who are poorest of the poor, they are the ones who are going to suffer. Now, you mentioned about COP, and of course, many a times I feel that so many promises are made. Is it a lip service or people are really serious? Where is the finance coming? Where is the technology transfer? Commitments are made, but then we don't really follow it with action. So I personally feel that the action is lacking, and it's not going to be that expensive. Carbon finance, okay, it can come in the form of soft loan. You talk of technology transfer, you have already developed the technology. Why you worry so much about what kind of returns that technology will bring to? The other question is regarding carbon credits. What do you feel about it? Is it that I will keep on committing sins, but I have money and therefore let your country do rest of the job? Or do you think it is something that the country should be asked that, okay, it can be at the most regional kind of action if you're talking of GHG? Because maybe what's going to happen in years to come, that the large companies will be able to claim that they are net zero because they'll buy carbon credits elsewhere. And you're in my country where we have small and medium size industries, they won't be able to afford that. So that can be another problem. And last but not the least, you talked about love and compassion. Dalai Lama's teaching, and I suppose all of us should follow, because what is happening in the world today, I don't see any solution to the ongoing war in Ukraine and USSR. And is it the time that we still haven't emerged from the pandemic and we start fighting, and then small fights here and there all around? So in which direction are we going? We are not understanding at all. Already nature is putting so much of pressure on us. There are diseases of various kinds. And on top of it, for what we are fighting, I don't know. Thank you.
Well, you want to tackle that? Well, I think just to set the ball rolling, I think it's there's this whole corporate side to the whole issue, right? And when we in the media cover the climate emergency, we tend to look at it only as an environmental issue and compartmentalize it so that it's just environment. And even the way we cover COP or COP26 and the way Glasgow was covered, it was just on that part. Sometimes we talked about funding and credits and all that, but otherwise it was mainly an environmental issue. But we have never really looked at, like you mentioned Ukraine, it's a fossil fuel war, right? And so was Kuwait, so was Iraq, right? So you have to look at the political economy of this climate crisis, and I think we in the media have largely failed to do that. Luckily, it's not just journalists who write in media. We also have experts and academics who write, and they're the ones who draw attention to this, because journalists are, generalists, and we cover a little bit of everything. So they're the ones who really focus on the political or the economic side of it. But how does that translate to the grassroots? And because this is one war, because it's happening in Europe. The Yemen war didn't really affect the whole world so much. Fuel prices didn't go up. Food prices didn't really go up that much. But the Ukraine war is doing that. And the whole world, and it's... And fertilizer. So it has had an impact on the global economy, and that is making it more difficult to meet some of the targets that were set in Glasgow. Yeah. But it's also an opportunity because it can force us to go away from fossil fuels. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think how this translates is, again, the challenge on the promises. We have had so many promises on climate finance, and we keep talking about energy. We keep talking about access to energy. When I come from a country and a continent where there are still people who don't have access to energy. And this is not climate justice. And when you talk about a just transition, what does it mean? We cannot say that we are buying our way out of the climate crisis. That's not possible. We can never buy our way out of the climate crisis. We have to take the needed, necessary action. And we cannot continue with our former ways and expect to say that we are solving the climate crisis. Many times people don't talk about historical emissions, and that's why we have instances of countries and corporations that want to buy their way out of the climate crisis. Because if science says we have to stop emissions, and emissions keep rising, how are we going to get ourselves out of the climate crisis? It's not going to be fair if it's at the expense of the people who have least contributed. Sometimes we talk about how we are trying to do action, and we talk about how corporations and businesses are trying to solve the crisis. But deep down, like you've mentioned, we have a lot of greenwash at the moment. Why is it that still there's a lot of pretense of climate action when this is actually a crisis? This is not something we should be trying to pretend to be taking action. We should actually be taking the real action. And I think we don't realize the magnitude with which our actions today are impacting grassroots communities that are most impacted. Because then these are people who have least contributed. But again, we talk about climate finance for communities and countries that are impacted by the crisis. But it's been years, every time it's more promises, but nothing keeps being delivered. So we're definitely ignoring the crisis. We are lying to the world, we are lying to the children, we are lying to communities who are impacted by this crisis, that we are doing something. We are lying to the children that we care about them. We are lying to the children that we love them, but we don't. Because if we did, then we would take this crisis as a crisis, and every leader, every corporation would do what they must do to respond to the crisis. Because if today people are struggling to find food and water, and I love referencing the children a lot because they're not just sitting back. They've chosen not to be victims, but again, they're the most impacted, but they continue to be the most impacted. They're the ones who will live longer with the consequences of today's decisions, with the consequences of the wrong actions that we choose to take today. And that is not climate justice in itself. So I think the point of it is we cannot buy ourselves out of the climate crisis. We have to take real action, and we have to stop ignoring the climate crisis.
You in your Glasgow speech, you said one sentence that really struck me, which is, when we look after trees, trees will look after us. That's such a simple sentence, and it's such a truism. It's almost like, yeah, so what's new, right? But then you've really taken the value of a tree, a fruit tree in a school in Kenya, the rainforest in the Amazon, which is the planet's lungs, and you've really brought the discussion down to that level. What is that the reason you also chose trees to work with first? Children and trees, bring them together.
I would say, I think the forest has always been a part of me, and I planted my first tree when I was 7, and it's an experience I remember up to date. And I strongly believe that trees speak and they communicate to us. I learn a lot from the trees. Trees are nature, they are everything. And just being able to understand that this tree is not just a tree, this is the air we breathe, it's the food that we eat, it's about the health around the planet, it's everything connected, it's about the water that we drink, and not just looking at the tree as, the branches and the tree trunk, but looking at it from a point where this is humanity's survival. This is why we are surviving, because we have these resources. And for me, I always like to use the tree as that symbol of nature, because I grew up among the trees, and being able to understand that I can also learn from the trees. Trees talk to us, and I think being able to have that special connection with the trees, then it can be really important also for ourselves, but also the fact that we continue to sideline nature, even in these climate conversations, is really sad, because we do not understand that we are nature ourselves, and we do not understand how interconnected we are with nature as the human race. That when we continue destroying nature, that we are also interfering with our very own survival. And looking at nature in itself, I keep saying that if we are to solve the climate crisis, and if we are to meet all the targets of the climate crisis, we're not going to achieve them without nature. We will need nature. And we will need to not only regenerate nature, but also to make sure that we are protecting all the remaining natural ecosystems right now. And that is why we cannot continue with our former ways of doing things. We cannot continue destroying our ecosystems and sit back hoping that we are solving the climate crisis. It's not going to happen if we keep sidelining nature.
And that's such a universal theme, because not far from here, in the other Indian state of Uttarakhand, in Garhwal, you had what was the movement called, where the women, the Chipko movement, where women hugged trees that were about to be cut by loggers and physically attached themselves to trees so that they would not be cut. And so that the power of trees and the symbolism of nature is quite powerful. We have about 10 minutes left, so yes, there is one question here.
Hi, my name is Sechu Dolma, and my question is about, I feel like there's a big elephant in the room about, this has been a very positive conversation, but I can't stop thinking, when Kunda mentioned your age, I couldn't stop thinking about this 25-year-old Sewang Norbu who just self-immolated himself about more than a month ago inside Tibet. And a lot of your talk has been about youth being empowered and taking their first action. But so I want to hear more about your advice on what do we do inside Tibet in terms of living in a very autocratic state. We're occupied by China. There's not much movement. If a youth speaks up about the environment, about mining, we've had more than 155 self-immolations just in the last few years. And this, a lot of these immolations have been about language rights, about mining, about resource extraction. And so it comes at a huge cost of people's lives. And these self-immolations have ranged in all ages, but we've had teenagers, we've had people in their 20s. So yeah, I want to hear about what is your advice for youth who live in very, very oppressive states where their lives are at stake, and what can they do to become, because we hear a lot about, Fridays for Climate. We hear, it's really good, and I love seeing news about it, but how can we make it more relevant for places like Tibet and other parts of the world where it comes at the cost of your life, your family's lives, and your community's lives?
Thank you. And what you've mentioned really strongly speaks a lot for environmental defenders, that people who are trying to defend the land, defend the planet, defend nature, but still their lives are at risk. They still cannot be able to do this in a safe or open way. And I think this is the point where we talk about the privileges in other parts of the world, that how can the world be in solidarity? How can young activists, for instance, from other states where there's a privilege to actually speak up for the challenges in different parts of the country, how can they use their voices and their privileges to actually support some of the works that you're trying to do and amplify? And I think it's always important that we also amplify voices that are actually under such challenges. And I think I have had friends reach out, for example, they come from similar states and they have challenges and they're trying to speak up. And I think one of the most important thing, and I would really love to connect with the youth climate activist movement here, because one of the main things that has continued to work is around solidarity, where we get to educate each other and let each other know what is happening in our countries where we come from. And then in unison, we are able to find ways in which we can amplify voices from places where they're not able to actually be amplified. They're not able to have that platform to speak up. They're not able to actually feel safe, speaking up. And I think that's the most important thing. And again, the fact that there are also rising campaigns and movements at the moment, like trying to make ecocide an international law, then this is something that would definitely in the future make sure that also environmental defenders are actually, safer and feel protected. And I would say we have had a similar challenge as well in my country, where there was an environmental defender who was murdered as well, trying to defend public green space. And at the moment, there has been defenders trying to feed into the country's law to try and make sure that actually environmental defenders feel safe in their own countries. Because then these are people who are protecting the planet. They are protecting the land. They're protecting nature. They're protecting the trees. They're protecting humanity. So if anything, environmental defenders should be protected, should actually be able to feel safe in their own communities, should be able to feel safe communicating. And I think for me, the best would be solidarity and connecting with movements around, and especially movements of young people who actually do already have the privilege. And I think that's how things would continue to actually make a difference eventually.
Elizabeth, you seem to have a lot of fan base in the Philippines. There's another one from there. If a school would allow to add a new subject in its curriculum that would help educate students, what would it be? A new subject in school?
Climate change.
Activism,
yeah,
maybe?
Most of the times environmental education and climate change is definitely not like one of those compulsory subjects in the schools. It's something that you either take as a course or find it somewhere along the way. But I think starting from when someone is really young, there are certain skills that we learn when you're children. And I think one of the things, right now in my country, there's a new curriculum that has just included environmental activities where it starts with the little children and goes all the way. But I think it's important that we make sure that climate change and environmental matters are actually in the curriculum, because some of the things we're trying to do through these initiatives is to try and make sure that there is a form of learning through experiential learning, where it's not just about the jargon words, it's not just about hearing about climate change, but what can everyone do? It's about making sure that it's actually experiential learning, and this is something that can definitely happen when one is still at a young age. Because I believe that behaviors and attitudes begin to change at a young age, and this includes behaviors and attitudes towards how we treat nature, how we respond to the crisis, how we respond to our natural resources as well. It begins at a young age. So it's really important that we incorporate some of these subjects also in the curriculum entirely, and make sure that it's not just putting it there for the sake, but actually it's experiential and that we are doing it to change society.
So Elizabeth, what next for you? You're an undergrad, you're an activist, you've achieved so much. What next?
Activism is my day-to-day life, and it never stops. And it will not stop until we get everything that's supposed to be done. And I think that's one of the most important things that I'll definitely keep pushing, because it looks like every day we have new challenges. Every day we have new things to fight for. And as well, I always say that there's so much worth fighting for right now. And we cannot sit back and say that, activism will not have an end. Because as well, we are living on this planet. Every day we are going to be faced with new challenges. And unless we strongly find ourselves in that position where we can always step up, where we can actually feel the challenges and step up and do what we can, then it's not going to be possible to have that livable world and a safe future. And I think for me, as a young activist, I'll definitely keep pushing for these things. I'll keep educating myself as well. I'll keep educating other people. And most importantly, I'll keep building those movements, because I believe in people power. I believe that the people are the ones who are going to make this change happen. But again, the people need to be empowered. The people need to understand and feel strongly that they actually have the power to make things happen. And for me, that's one of my greatest focus. And as well for the year, I'll keep pushing. COP27 is coming, and like I've mentioned, we cannot say that we are waiting for COP27 to say what we will do. Action has to start now. And I think it would be important for everyone to join in, to keep pushing for action right now, and not to wait for other fake promises at the COP, but rather to push for governments to do what must be done, because we know what must be done. You know, the leaders know what must be done, and what we can do is keep pushing for real urgent action. And what's most important is that we can all do something, and every sector has got to also do something, because like I mentioned, this is also about every other sector. It's about our investment choices. It's about the policies we are putting forward and the policies we are trying to make sure that are actually implemented. And it's also about how, you know, individuals respond to certain things, because we, the people who understand and feel strongly, are the ones who are going to make this change happen.
Thank you. Very inspiring. And at least for me, one last question maybe.
Yes, I have a curiosity. Trees and woods are also the natural habitats of animals, and especially in Africa, you have many wild animals living in the trees, in the woods. And as humans encroach on the wilderness, on these areas, you also have poaching, and so. In your activities, in your awareness raising, what place do animals and the protection of animals who live in the woods, in the wilderness have? What place do animals and the protection of animals? We talked about nature, nature with a capital N, which is more abstract, but if I think of the trees, I also think of the birds who live in the trees, and the chimpanzees and the gorillas, and that are also threatened. And part of the biodiversity loss is also the loss of wild animal life in these trees.
Yeah, so the animals have a very huge place in this conversation. And just as you've mentioned that question, I reflected of, I think a month back, when a documentary was done by BBC on how wild animals are dying because of the drought. Because then it's not just around the trees, it's about every living thing that is in this forest. And these animals are also the most impacted. And as you were talking, I kept reflecting of those pictures of giraffes lying down lifeless because they did not have any water to drink. They walk for miles around the forest, the rivers are dry, and there's definitely the crisis, the rains have not returned. And I think looking at all these challenges, it is important to note that animals definitely has got a huge role to play. And when we talk about nature, we talk about biodiversity. And definitely in this conversation, we are losing our biodiversity at alarming rates to all those challenges that you've mentioned. And we can never say that we are protecting nature without looking at all of biodiversity. And if anything, at time that we need to look at the earth as a whole system, with all the plants, all the animals, the human beings. How is it that we are able to make sure that we have that connection, maintain that connection, and maintain that balance where we're able to live on this planet as a whole system? And actually, when we are responding to the climate crisis, we cannot say that we are responding to the crisis without making sure that biodiversity is protected. And I also mentioned that when we talk about nature protection, it goes beyond restoring the degraded lands. It's also about how are we protecting what we already have at the moment. How are we making sure that the endangered species list doesn't continue increasing by day? We have to make sure that we are protecting all of biodiversity, and that means that animals and plants all have a space when it comes to the conversations around nature. So when you talk about nature, we're not just talking about the trees. We need to focus on the whole earth as a whole system, where it's about the animals, the plant species, and everything that connects us, and then make sure all of this is protected and is actually well balanced, so that we can also be able to survive as humanity.
Thank you. I've been inspired by this conversation, and I'm sure all of us have. For me personally, as a journalist who's like approaching retirement, it's given me a booster shot. I've actually felt like, I need to do more and really get more to the heart of where the problems are. And like you, I think the most encouraging thing about your work for me from what I've heard, is that you haven't waited for climate finance or the historical polluters and the emitters to give some money out of guilt to developing countries to reforest. You've done things on your own, and you've been catalytic in your own country, and the example you've set, and from the questions we've got on Zoom, we know that the examples you've set are actually spreading around the world. And you are a true inheritor of Professor Maathai's legacy, and I think you probably are a new avatar. Thank you very much. Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm also very much inspired. Yeah. And I think all of us will look differently from today onwards at trees. Yeah. It was a deep dive in the issue. Many questions, some were quite confusing, some were resolved here on this panel. And I would like to thank you on behalf of the organizers and present your kata, first to Elizabeth. Yeah. Thank you very much. Kunda, thank you very much. It was very powerful. Now, there are some announcements I would like to do. First of all, Sonam Wangchula from Ladakh is arriving or has arrived in Dharamsala. He's coming with the ice block from the Himalaya glaciers. And tomorrow morning, the panelists will have an audience with His Holiness, and this ice block will be also presented to His Holiness. So this is something that I would like to announce, and he will be afterwards on the terrace down. So please join us in welcoming him, and just exchange some thoughts with him. Then tomorrow we will start at 1 o'clock here with panel 1, and Greg sent me some notes that I have to present to you. Yes, we have a very special panel tomorrow. Carl Pope, former director of Sierra Club, will be here. Mitzi Jonel Tan from the Philippines. I think that's one of the reasons why we also had many questions here from Philippines, and I would like to inform our Philippine viewers to join us here tomorrow. Ellie Shine from Italy, Vice President of the Emilia-Romagna region. Diana Liverman, Professor of Geography and Development of the University of Arizona. She'll be joining us online. And there's also Viva Davan, who we already heard today here. So please, tomorrow at 1 o'clock, come here. Then the panelists are asked to stay here after this program. We need to do a COVID test that's required for the audience tomorrow. That's just the information. And then I would like to draw your attention to this publication, which is done by the Tibetan Policy Institute. It's about Tibetan environment, and it's for free. Just have a copy there. Yeah. There is one on Tibetan environment, and then there's a second one with His Holiness and environment. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you very much for being with us here.